Crime is common, logic is rare. Therefore it is upon the logic rather than upon the crime that you should dwell. You have degraded what should have been a course of lectures into a series of tales.
For the longest time, Sherlock Holmes was my favorite character from all classic literature, and I think having that place in my reading life, he became sort of larger than life. I'm the kind of person who, if I really love something or I'm really excited about something, chances are I don't actually talk about it that much. I find it difficult to talk about or to explain, and Sherlock Holmes is one of those subjects. So I thought it was about time I actually dedicated an episode to Sherlock Holmes, and I think there will be more in the future as I go back and reread a lot of the stories. For those of you who don't know, the Sherlock Holmes series, the original series, was written by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, a Scottish author, and Sherlock Holmes takes place in the late 1800s, sort of the end of the reign of Queen Victoria, and a little bit into the Edwardian era, and even up to World War I. So it spans a long period in the life of Sherlock Holmes, the private consulting detective, and through it we see a lot of changes in society of Sir Arthur Conan Doyle's day, and changes in the character himself, Holmes, as he goes from being a sort of arrogant and self-confident young detective and student to a wiser and more introspective individual as he approaches middle age and then later on his 60s. So that is one reason to really love this series and really get into it, is those bigger themes that go beyond the episodic adventures and take you into another world, this world of the turn of the century, which Doyle lived in and wrote so much about. It's not a short series. All in all, it comes to 56 short stories and 4 novels, of which The Hound of the Baskervilles is not even the first. So that most famous story of Sherlock Holmes does not come first in order, and nor does it feature as the first novel. So even though it's a good look into the Sherlock Holmes series, it is by no means a complete picture of the character or of the series as a whole. As I speak, the 2 volumes by Barnes & Noble Classics, the hardcover editions, they're right under my microphone. I'm using them to prop up my microphone so I can stand. And then underneath that is my Encyclopedia Sherlockiana, which I will talk about a little bit later. I love these books. They have played a huge role in my life, which I thought I would talk about a bit. Sort of acknowledge my obsession, but also try to examine why it came to be. Why is Sherlock Holmes my favorite character to this day, and how come no other character has touched me so much as his? I'll never forget when I first picked up a Sherlock Holmes story. I was about 9 or 10 years old. This book was the original illustrated Sherlock Holmes. And this wasn't the complete series by any means. The book only contains the adventures of Sherlock Holmes, the memoirs of Sherlock Holmes, and The Return, and also The Hound of the Baskervilles. So you're missing the 3 other novels and 2 other collections of short stories. But nonetheless, this anthology of the stories shows you Holmes in his earlier career. And I started with A Scandal in Bohemia, so that was my first short story. And after that, I did not have any trouble getting into the rest of the stories. I was pretty much addicted from the first page. I have to give a lot of credit as well to the beautiful illustrations by Sidney Paget. He was the first, well, I shouldn't say the first, he was one of the earliest illustrators of Sherlock Holmes and went on to be the most famous. His illustrations of Sherlock Holmes are very much of the era, showing people in their everyday clothes, sort of in this illustrative style, black and white. There's something about his illustrations which bring a lot of emotion and movement to otherwise very static images. And interestingly enough, I think it was either him or his brother who also illustrated Treasure Island. And you can definitely see a resemblance if you've read the 2 books and seen the illustrations. So Sidney Paget definitely helped bring the series alive for me and helped me understand what was going on, because I was, at this time, just a kid. There were certainly many things in the series which I did not understand until I had been reading quite a few of the stories and started to get a gist of what was going on. Topics such as blackmail and the Victorian social hierarchy, various types of crime, and things that were going on. I didn't necessarily know what all of these things meant or fully understood them. So I learned a lot reading this series. It was a lot about history, but also about people and the way people appear and how you can sort of figure things out about them from little details about them. And this is a lot harder today than it was back then, and I'll get into that in a moment. But I was absolutely entranced by Sherlock Holmes's powers of deduction and the way he can figure things out about people, get to the bottom of these mysteries, which, to me, as the Watson character, I was completely overwhelmed by and amazed. So in the matter of a few days, I think, I sped through the adventures, the memoirs, and The Hound of the Baskervilles, and The Return. And from then on, Sherlock Holmes became my favorite character, and I was really crushed. There were no more stories after that, so I thought. Believe it or not, I was under that impression for several years, until I was about, I think, 12 or 13. So by my early teens, I was on the internet quite regularly. I think this is where I discovered the other stories, and most significantly, the first story, A Study in Scarlet. And I requested the books from the library and read them as fast as I could, and I was once again swept up in the world of Sherlock Holmes. And even though it wasn't quite the same experience as reading the stories as a 9 or 10-year-old, I was still very much swept up by the series, and my love for Sherlock Holmes had not diminished. I was a huge fan, and in fact, my fandom, if you will, was only just beginning. So the first thing a person does when they finish the Sherlock Holmes series is they look for other Sherlock Holmes books to read. And for me, that meant a rather painful and tedious voyage through the world of Sherlock Holmes pastiche, or spin-offs, if you will. I read some rather dreadful pastiche, including, to my mind, the Mary Russell series by Laurie King, which is a very popular series, but I personally do not like it, and the Minnesota series by Larry Millett. I didn't read the whole series of either of those, but I did struggle through some of the books, and it was just because I really liked the character and I wanted to read more about him. But I found those series to be ultimately disappointing. Of the good stories that I read, I do remember enjoying some of the ones from a collection called, I think it was Holmes for the Holidays, and it was Christmas-themed stories. And I also enjoyed Sherlock Holmes versus Dracula. That was one of the better pastiche books that I read. I also discovered Encyclopedia Sherlockiana, which I mentioned earlier, and it's basically a collection of Holmes facts and trivia and characters and basically anything you want to know about Sherlock Holmes. It's not the most complete book, but I have enjoyed having this book. It's got some fun pictures in it from various movies and illustrations. I really spent a lot of time with that book, I have to admit. And it was in this way that I ended up storing up in my mind a huge amount of fandom knowledge about Sherlock Holmes. A lot of this, I have to say, I've retained ever since, even though I haven't actively tried to remember it. I think things that you learn at that age, between like 9 and 12, you just don't forget it. And I can tell you things like Holmes's eye color, which is officially gray. I can tell you that he's a little over 6 feet tall. I know that there's 4 women in the series with the first name of Violet, and also that his brother Mycroft is 7 years older than him, and that his birthday is traditionally celebrated on January 6th, 1854. I don't know how useful this knowledge is, but it's there in my head. I was, like I said, a crazy fan, and these are the kind of things that stick with you the rest of your life, whether you like it or not. And I'm sure Sherlock Holmes himself wouldn't be very amused with myself having stuffed my brain attic with this knowledge, but I can't help it. It's just something that was part of my life for a long, long time, and for better or worse, I have those pieces of knowledge stuck in my brain attic to this day. I would like to say that because of my vast Sherlock Holmes knowledge and my interest in the Victorian era, that I went on to write some great Sherlock Holmes fan fiction and even my own original characters. Well, that's simply not true. I did write fan fiction, but it was rather dreadful fan fiction. And by that, I mean it was somewhat cheesy and really poorly written, because I was trying to do it in a Victorian style and rather miserably failed. I wrote stories about Sherlock Holmes in his youth. I had an idea for one where Sherlock Holmes became an archaeologist and his brother Mycroft came and saved him from that career path. I had an idea for a story where Sherlock Holmes has a niece and a nephew, and his niece comes to visit him when he's living in the South Downs in his retirement. So I had a lot of good ideas, it's just that I didn't execute them very well. So those are pretty typical things that fans do, and again, I was the typical fan as a teenager, but it kind of went even beyond that. Part of me really identified with Sherlock Holmes from a young age, and I think it was because I wanted to sort of be more like him, because I was a very timid child, in part due to natural personality, and in part due to some things I experienced which really made me not want to try to be more outgoing. And this sort of covers other characters in literature as well. I always have related to sort of loner characters or characters that aren't popular with the rest of the characters. More than that, I really wanted to solve problems that were bigger than my own personal problems. It was a type of escapism, and I'm not saying I actually thought through this growing up. I certainly didn't, but it was there in the back of my mind, in my subconscious, I guess. So I began to take up Sherlock Holmes's hobbies. I decided to study chemistry in my high school years, which actually went pretty well. I almost majored in chemistry, but changed my mind because I decided I didn't like experiments as much as I thought I would. I just enjoyed the math aspects of it. I decided to learn violin at age 12, and for me that was kind of starting late because most people start violin when they're like 6 or 7. But I did that for many years and thoroughly enjoyed it. Really would have liked to major in that as well, but didn't end up doing that. And more entertainingly, I tried to study the art of deduction by looking at footprints or tire tracks and observing people. And I even started a deduction journal where I would write down things that I thought I had deduced about people, but I didn't get very far with that. I also considered a career as an FBI special agent, and when I say considered, I'm only half joking. I actually went on the website to look at some information about it. I was pretty serious in my fandom, and more than just being things that a fan would do, I think it was just a fun way to connect with the stories and even connect with other fans. Ultimately, I learned a lot of things that I wouldn't have learned otherwise. I promise you I did not take up smoking or drugs, which Holmes is very famous for and which have been made even more famous in the latest series, the BBC Sherlock series. I didn't do any of that. I've never wanted to smoke or take drugs. And to parents out there, I would say those are definitely important topics to talk to your children about and have healthy conversations about. I do think that reading a book about someone who does those things doesn't necessarily mean you'll want to do them yourself. In the Sherlock Holmes series, these things are not glorified. Smoking was pretty normal back in the day, but as for drugs, Watson very strongly is opposed to Sherlock Holmes's drug intake, and in the Jeremy Brett series, Sherlock Holmes actually gives up drugs at one point, which I think was a good addition to the series. All of these things I just mentioned were pretty big moments in my life or decisions, but I think the biggest one, and the one which I always think of when I think about how Sherlock Holmes has affected my life, is how he helped me with my social anxiety issues. I said I was a very timid child. That is not really an understatement. I had trouble looking people in the face, shaking their hand, talking to strangers, when it was called for, and just overall very, very low confidence. One thing that really helped me was seeing Sherlock Holmes, who is not really a chatty or sociable character, but someone who has no problem talking to people and entering a situation with confidence. And that really helped me learn to adopt some of the same, I wouldn't say mannerisms, but like the same attitude that he has. And I mean in a positive way, not in a negative way. There were times that I literally envisioned myself sort of being Sherlock Holmes, or at least like really consciously trying to be like him, and that actually helped me through many social situations, believe it or not. I would just, if I was really feeling nervous, I would just sort of turn on my Sherlock Holmes mode, and I would try to greet people with a smile and look them in the eye and exude confidence that I didn't have naturally. That really helped a lot. So between that and my own parents' encouragement and, them helping me go out there and be more confident, this just really made a big difference as I was moving from my tween years into my teenage years. Finally, and the last thing I'll say about how Sherlock Holmes affected me as a person, I would say that I have always been a fairly emotional person, and you probably noticed it on this podcast. I got pretty emotional when I talked about Shusaku Endo's The Sea and Poison, and probably will continue to get emotional about books that really touch me. But I've always been that way, and it's something that I've always been a little bit, almost ashamed of, because I just have trouble, not being emotional, basically. Although, at this point, you probably wouldn't know that if you met me. I have always admired how Sherlock Holmes can control his emotions, and I really idealized that throughout my teenage years. I would say this had a mixed result in my life. On the one hand, it did help me with the confidence and with not wearing my heart on my sleeve all the time. I mean, I wasn't going to necessarily do that anyway, but it just gave me another awareness, I guess, and a way to handle my emotions without just showing everybody how I felt all the time. I would say on the negative side, I had difficulty expressing my emotions in a constructive way for a long time, and I still struggle with it. I think that it's not the right solution to turn off your emotions, which I had tried to do for a long time. I think it's better to realize you have emotions and then find constructive ways to express them and determine when it is appropriate to express them and when it's not appropriate, rather than just sort of turning them off in a blanket decision. So it is something that I connect with Sherlock Holmes, the character, and being a fan of him. And again, it's been both sort of a plus and a minus. It just depends on, the situation. But overall, I think, once again, Sherlock Holmes did so much for my social anxiety in terms of helping me overcome it. And I think that was, in the end, a huge positive in my life. To wrap this up, I wanted to share sort of a lightning round of some Sherlock Holmes TV and movie adaptations and sort of talk about my thoughts on each of those, but I'll try to keep it brief. So the first one, and of course my top favorite, is the Jeremy Brett series from the 80s and 90s. And this was something that aired on Masterpiece Mystery, and it starred Jeremy Brett as Sherlock Holmes and David Burke as Watson, and later Edward Hardwicke replaced David Burke as Watson. This is the most accurate portrayal of Sherlock Holmes I've seen, and in spite of that, Jeremy Brett was probably too old to play the 27-year-old Sherlock Holmes. He really brought out a lot of aspects of the character which had never been touched on before, such as Holmes's quirks and his sort of, mood swings. And really, Jeremy Brett made Sherlock Holmes a character worthy of the screen. So often Sherlock Holmes is portrayed as this sort of one-dimensional cartoon character in a way, or just a very flat character, but Jeremy Brett showed how much dimension there is to the character, and he got that straight from the books. They say that he would argue with the screenwriters when he reviewed the script if he saw something that wasn't close to the book, and there's just so many interesting stories like that about Jeremy Brett's portrayal of Sherlock Holmes, but it goes to show how much he was dedicated to the original material and why his Sherlock Holmes was such a epic success. So if you've never watched the series, I highly, highly recommend it. It's one of my favorite movie series just in general. And the costumes are really good, the sets are really good. You feel like you're back in Victorian England. In some ways, it's underrated because a lot of people haven't heard of it, but if you're a Sherlock Holmes fan, it's really worth checking out. Not all of the episodes are great. There are a few that are not so great, but certainly The Adventures of Sherlock Holmes is a solid series. And he did not film all of the 56 short stories and 4 novels, but he did film a significant portion of the original stories. Okay, that was not a very quick summary, but since it's my favorite, I just had to go into it in a little bit of detail. And the next one is one most people have heard of, and this is the Basil Rathbone and Nigel Bruce series from World War II, basically. And some of the episodes are World War II propaganda. Most of the series is not purist by any means, but it's a fun series to watch, and I really like Rathbone as Holmes. He kind of plays more into the superhero side of Holmes, as opposed to Jeremy Brett's adaptation. But one of the highlights from that series is The Hound of the Baskervilles, and that was one of the few episodes where Basil Rathbone plays Sherlock Holmes in the Victorian era. So I recommend The Hound of the Baskervilles. It's a good one. Another good series is the Ronald Howard series from the 1950s. This was one I did not hear of until much later after I'd read the books. And it's a very light-hearted series. It's almost a comedy. This will definitely appeal to a lot of people who don't really enjoy the darker side of the series, and it's just good fun to watch. I really enjoy it. I really like H. Marion Crawford, who is the Watson in this series. I think he's one of the best Watsons, and I recommend the Ronald Howard series if you've never watched it before. A couple of ones I really didn't like that much were the Christopher Lee movies from the 1990s. And I really like Christopher Lee from The Lord of the Rings, but as Sherlock Holmes, he didn't really come across as true to the character to me. And the scripts in his 2 Sherlock Holmes movies were pretty dreadful. They really watched like some horrible fan fiction, and I just did not enjoy them very much, but they're good for a laugh. So if you want to watch those, they're called Sherlock Holmes and the Leading Lady, and then there's a sequel called Incident at Victoria Falls. Another one I didn't really like that much was Young Sherlock Holmes from 1985, and this one shows Sherlock Holmes in his teenage years, and it's got sort of themes that are similar to Harry Potter and Indiana Jones, and those are not movies I've ever watched, but that's what I've read online. And it was just sort of a weak script. It wasn't a horrible movie, it just wasn't that great. So, I don't know. It's kind of fun if you're a Sherlock Holmes fan, but it's not what I would call a great adaptation or even a great spin-off. I actually preferred another series which is pretty obscure. It's called Young Sherlock, The Mystery of the Manor House. And this is a series from the 1980s, so it's pretty low budget and a little bit stagey, but I really enjoy the story, and it's just entertaining, and lots of it is pretty funny, so I liked it. It's a little slow, but there's something about the story that just really rings true to me, and I think it's more enjoyable than Young Sherlock Holmes. Another adaptation worth checking out, and which is famous for a reason, is the Russian adaptation from the 1980s, and this one stars Vasily Livanov as Sherlock Holmes. I don't know if I watched a full episode, but I've seen clips of this on YouTube. I actually really enjoy it. I think Livanov makes a great Sherlock Holmes, and I don't remember the name of the actor who plays Watson, but he seemed pretty good too, so if you don't mind watching something in subtitle, or if you are Russian, I do recommend that one as well. Finally, there's the recent BBC series called Sherlock, starring Benedict Cumberbatch and Martin Freeman, and this one has pretty much taken the fandom by storm and created many more people who are fans of the Sherlock series and may or may not be fans of the books, because it's really its own thing, and it's basically Sherlock Holmes in modern day. I enjoyed the first series, Series 1, and a couple of episodes from Season 2. I still think the best episode was the very first one called A Study in Pink, and that's sort of a play on the original book, A Study in Scarlet. I think in the first 2 series overall, I didn't watch the one with Irene Adler because I didn't think I would like it, but apart from that, I felt like the first 2 series were doing some interesting things with setting Sherlock Holmes stories in the modern day, and for the most part they were pretty enjoyable, pretty funny at times and creative, using technology and things Sherlock Holmes would have now at his disposal, and really playing up the quirky, unpredictable side of Sherlock, just in the same way Jeremy Brett did, except Benedict Cumberbatch's portrayal is even more exaggerated and sort of out there. I did watch Series 3 as well, and at this point, I was pretty hopeful that it would be a good series, but I felt like it really went downhill in terms of the script, and I felt like Sherlock Holmes was becoming more and more out of character, and that the script writers were really catering to the fans of Sherlock the series as opposed to Sherlock Holmes the book series. Series 3 was full of inside jokes and sort of fandom-specific lines and script choices. And even though I was able to get most of those references, as just an adaptation, it didn't seem very intelligent, I guess. I didn't really like it, and I wouldn't watch it again. I just really was turned off by Series 3, and so I didn't end up watching Series 4, which I hear became even more, shall we say, original. And I know a lot of people will disagree with me, but that's my personal opinion of Sherlock. I would certainly go back and rewatch some of the earlier episodes from seasons 1 and 2. So as I've said, I haven't really talked about Sherlock Holmes before on my blog or on my podcast, just in passing or a few posts here and there. A big reason for this sort of fading out of Sherlock Holmes in my life is that in my mid-teens, I read The Lord of the Rings for the first time. And if you've ever read it, and especially if you enjoyed it, you'll understand how reading The Lord of the Rings can sort of take over your interests for a while. And I was basically transferring my obsession, if you will, over to The Lord of the Rings. And I was a big Lord of the Rings fan for many years too, and enjoyed the movies and the books and all kinds of things related to it. That's not to say that I stopped being a fan of Sherlock Holmes, it's just that my interests did change after I read that book. And then after I left my teenage years, I really stopped having fandoms. Part of me is kind of sad about that, although part of me is also relieved because now I don't feel like I have to have all the books of this or all of the movies of that, or, you know, I feel like being in a fandom can be a good thing and a bad thing. I don't really like getting obsessed over books anymore, although I certainly do now and then. It's just that I don't seek out fandoms, and so I actively avoid some fandoms just so I won't get into them again. But I still love Sherlock Holmes. And I'm thinking very soon I will reread the entire series. I tried to do it in the last year or two, but I just couldn't get into it. I think now that I have waited just that little bit longer, I'm going to be ready soon to do a full rereading. And it'll be the first time that I've reread some of those stories, so I'm excited to see what I discover and rediscover, and, you know, whether my obsession comes back, I guess. It's wonderful to discover new characters and new stories that inspire you, but I think we all need that book or that character who sticks with us through our lives, because through that character you can see how you've changed as a person, and you can also hold on to some of those ideas and ideals which inspired you as a child or as a teenager. For me, that's Sherlock Holmes.